So unfortunately, I had to reset that video, ran out of memory. And so now when we look at this segment, we left off on, again, the ovarian cycle was going one direction. You have your oocyte around a follicle. That follicle keeps getting larger. But this follicle isn't just about nourishing the egg, the oocyte. It's also going to remain and encourage some hormones. So let's talk about hormones now, even up here. Now, this hormone here, FSH and LH, and you don't need to worry about this for the exam, but it's important for background, that in our brain, we release this hormone called gonadotropin hormone, and this will initiate this green line. As it increases, its job is to cause your pituitary gland or your brain to release FSH and LH. This will be placed in the bloodstream, and then it will eventually arrive to where the ovaries are. And so, FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone. So doesn't it make sense right now that if this is our follicle, it's stimulated. You can even see as it goes and it increases around ovulation time. You can see that this oocyte gets released and the follicle. So this FSH encourages the follicle to release the egg. So does the luteinizing hormone. That's what LH stands for. And so luteinizing hormone, luteal, kind of like luteinizing, it's based off of that word, is basically named after the fact that when our follicle remains, it turns into our corpus luteum. Now, where it matters now, as far as like when we look at this portion, is, and for your exam, is that if you look at these levels, this is the baseline level during day 0 during the menstrual phase. So these hormones, these hormones, they are connected with the uterine cycle. And so when the follicle is developing, you can see that estrogen is the highest it's going to be, inhibin is the highest it's going to be. These two will facilitate also the release, or it'll indicate the release of that oocyte from the follicle. And then what occurs after is that this follicle will then turn into a corpus luteum, and then this plays a role in stimulating progesterone and once more stimulating estrogen once more to rise up a little bit more. And so progesterone and estrogen are what ensure a continuing development of the uterine lining, the functional layer of the uterine lining. In the secretory phase, they encourage its development all the way until the very end. And once we reach the end of those baseline levels of hormones, right, we're really starting all over at the very beginning when you think about it, right? Because if we dropped all the way down, you can see now we begin our menstrual phase again. So that's the major take home. Oocytes develop within follicles. These follicles remain behind to turn into corpus luteum, a mature one, and a corpus albicanus. And when they do so, they cause the release of estrogens and progesterones during the secretory phase so that the uterine cycle can continue to develop until that final day of the uterine cycle. And so, to wrap up our slides, all we really need to talk about is that very thing, the ovarian cycle, meaning the development of our oocytes. So this is nothing we haven't just mentioned, but now we're going to get into a little bit more specific details. For example, our eggs begin somewhere we refer to as primordial eggs. Like think about them. Follicles and eggs. Primordial follicles that contain their eggs. And before puberty, you have about 2 million of these, and after puberty, a lot of them disappear through a process called atresia. And so by puberty, you're left with around 400,000 follicles, primordial follicles, that can develop further and help develop eggs further. And so they begin in something we refer to as an egg nest, right? Because it's just like kind of like where the birds put eggs in nests. And so you can see that all of these do not have any follicles. But then we reach our primary follicle. And what a follicle is, remember how we said that an egg develops within a follicle? It's made up of 2 cells, granulosa cells and thecal endocrine cells. If we go to the text that corresponds to that, you can see we have our thecal endocrine cells and granulosa cells. And these cells work together to produce estrogen, which again, as a reminder, estrogen is important for the development of the functional layer of the uterine cycle for during the secretory phase, right? And not just secretory phase, but also the proliferative phase. Proliferative phase and secretory phase. That's why you can see that as estrogen increases, right, as it's increasing, you can see we're in the proliferative phase, and then both together, estrogen and progesterone, they continue the development during the secretory phase. And so that's what the follicle does, is that it stimulates the uterus to prepare. It's telling the uterus, hey, I have an egg coming, prepare that uterine lining, so it will use estrogen for that. And then so we use our images here. You can see we have a secondary one, and we're going to talk about secondary and tertiary at the same time. And so there's just a few more things to add. You still have thecal cells and granulosa cells, which again are responsible for the release and control of estrogen. And then you have a space outside of the cell called zona pellucida, like zone pellucida, right? And so zona pellucida is just the region around the oocyte. It's this translucent region that you can see. It looks like there's nothing there, but there is. And again, called zona pellucida. And if we move a little bit further, you can still see here the tertiary ovarian follicle how it now has a follicle that has developed to a 3rd degree, right? Not a 2nd degree, but it's really fully mature. And the next step really is to eventually release that oocyte from that follicle. And something that we see during the tertiary follicle to get there is that, again, this is occurring. Remember, ovulation occurs around approximately day 15. And so the formation of the tertiary follicle takes place before that, 10th day to the 14th day. And again, that secondary follicle will turn into a tertiary one, and then a new structure arises called corona radiata, which sounds like radiating crown is what it translates over. And if you look at our oocyte, you can see it has this layer of cells that surrounds it. That's what we mean by the crown, the radiating crown. And this is known for contributing proteins to the developing oocyte. And corona radiata. And just like before, if we follow even our pictures, this, you see it, we have our primary to becoming our secondary, becoming our tertiary, and then finally, ovulation is the release of that egg with its corona radiata, and then the follicle remains in the ovary, turning into a corpus luteum. And recall what corpus luteum does, right? Corpus luteum, again, is responsible for secreting progesterone and estrogen, which will again mature the uterine lining during that secretory phase, right? Because the egg has been released. It has been released during ovulation now. So this corpus luteum stays behind, releasing or encouraging the release of progesterone, telling the uterus, hey, I just let this egg go through the uterine tube. You better be ready for me. That's its role. And then it just further deteriorates, and your ovaries will recycle the components, but for the most part, it degenerates, and that will mark the end of the ovarian cycle. And that's what corpus albicanus is. It's really marking the end of it, because you can see our corpus luteum is already degenerating, and the materials that make up the follicle, those cells, right, the thecal, endocrine cells, granulosa, all those components will be recycled to create brand new follicles for a brand new egg during the ovarian cycle. So the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle are occurring at the same time, but different things are occurring, right? But they are connected because these cells that make up the follicle, the thecal cells and the granulosa cells, are controlling the actual functional layer of the uterus. And then ovulation, again, is when that tertiary follicle releases that oocyte and its corona radiata into the uterine tube. And this is typically referred to as the end of the follicular phase, but do not worry about this for our test. And so with that, and again, this is a simple thought, right? Like, it's just the second that the oocyte gets released, you don't need the follicle anymore. So it's, again, marking the end of the follicular phase, and that follicle will turn into a corpus luteum. And so that about wraps it up. I believe there's was one more page to discuss, and that's just in the vagina now. Again, cervix is that surrounding structure, and here's our external O's, the entry into the uterus. This segment here is going to be the vagina, or the vaginal canal is going to the space, but all together the vagina. And inside ruga, we're no strangers to this word. It means wrinkles. And this is where you would encounter the hymen. This is the vestibule. Recall that when we went over the vulva, vestibule meant the entryway, the pathway, or the opening of the entire vulva leading into the vagina. And so that's the same vestibule that we're seeing here. We're seeing the labia minora, the smaller lip. And with that, we're also seeing those same glands, the greater vestibular glands that were responsible for providing moisture. And that's really it. I see the word fornix, but it's going to be this groove or this indentated space, but don't worry about this one. This is one that you can take off. It's just this groove that lies around the cervix. And so with that, and the hymen. The hymen is something that before there is any penetration or sexual activity, there's this layer of connective tissue, an epithelial tissue that's just on top of this segment, and that gets ruptured during the first sexual encounter, or sometimes through heavy physical exercise, and sometimes even horseback riding. And again, but any penetration through the use through sex or through tampons will cause this lining to rupture. And so I believe that is it for this and for this chapter. So if you made it this far, you want some extra credit, get these labels in, because this works really well with your lab. So if you need to know this for your lecture exam, you might as well just learn to label it on this. If you can label it on this, especially this model, you can label it on the lab models in lab, because this is what you're going to be looking at in lab. Most of the structures in reproductive are asked from this perspective, and not just that, I have one for female as well. And we have a uterus in the lab. You want to make sure that you're able to actually label as well. So extra credit, bring this to lab, your next lab session, and get these labels in, because they are going to be in your lab exam, but also your lecture exam. So it's kind of nice. And I may include them in your lecture exam. So hint, hint, you might have a lot of questions that you might already know the answers to if you just practice that. Here are some practice questions for you and some flow charts that will be very helpful to complete and really help you understand. Bring them in on Tuesday and we can really discuss them together. All right, happy studying. Email me if anything. I'll get to them on Monday. And thank you for your patience with me in the last 2 days with the whole infection. Thank you.